They thought we would kneel. That's how it always started, with awe, with reverence, with small eyes looking up at the stars and whispering thanks to the heavens. The Galactic Concord had seen it all before. Hundreds of worlds, thousands of species, all bowing low when the first contact envoys arrived in their shimmering ships, draped in ceremonial light and cloaked in law older than most stars. Peace, they said. Unity, prosperity, all offered in exchange for compliance, structure, and obedience, and then they met us. The first human vessel they encountered was a mining ship, barely held together, patched with mismatched alloys, its reactors bleeding radiation like a wounded animal. It was a rusted, ugly thing, not a craft of beauty, not an ambassador of hope, just a workhorse, and yet, the moment the Concord hailed it, offering the traditional gifts of peace and dominion, it didn't respond with submission. It responded with suspicion, because we had seen empires before, we had built them, and watched them fall. Our history wasn't measured in millennia of order, but in centuries of chaos, blood, and survival. We knew the language of diplomacy, yes, but we also knew how quickly it could turn into the language of chains. The Concord's emissaries were confused. This species, barely interstellar, didn't react the way others did. Where was the reverence, the gratitude? They assumed we simply didn't understand the magnitude of the offer, so they sent more ships, formal diplomats, cultural liaisons, even soft threats disguised as policy and protocol. And we listened, polite, curious, silent, but underneath our civility we were studying them, watching, reading the gaps between their words, seeing the way their peace was structured not for equality, but for hierarchy, for subjugation. They weren't offering alliance, they were demanding assimilation, and perhaps, if they'd met us earlier in our history, they might have succeeded. Had they found us during our first steps to the stars, when our civilizations were still torn by war and division, they might have slid their chains over our wrists and called it unity, but they came too late. Because by then, we had already survived ourselves. We had burned through 2 great collapses, watched our planet teeter on the brink more than once. We had stared into the abyss of extinction and clawed our way back. And when we reached space, it wasn't because we sought salvation. It was because Earth was no longer enough. We were ready, not to be led, but to stand alone if necessary. That was what the Concord didn't understand. To them, unity was strength, to us, resistance was. The first real confrontation came at Proxima Station, a diplomatic outpost, neutral ground, or so they claimed, but they tried to plant a control beacon there. Just a safety measure, they said, just protocol. We dismantled it, not with weapons, but with intent. A technician, barely out of academy, cracked the encryption. Another wiped its memory core. When Concord security demanded we cease, they were met with a simple reply. This is our space. We do not bow. After that, things changed. The Concord started whispering. Who were these humans? Why weren't they afraid? What kind of species doesn't obey when faced with overwhelming power? The answer was simple. The kind that has already bled, that has already fallen, that has already learned. We did not reach the stars by chance. We fought for it, and when the galaxy finally opened its doors, we didn't come with open hands. We came with eyes wide open, and our fists clenched, because we weren't like the others. We didn't come to join the order. We came to question it, to test it, and if necessary, to rewrite it. They weren't ready for us, but we were more than ready for them. They say history is written by the victors, but what happens when the victors are afraid of their own memories? The Galactic Concord's archives contain millennia of treaties, laws, and diplomatic records, carefully curated, ruthlessly polished, sterile as the halls they're kept in. You can read about the first expansion, the Great Migration Waves, the Unity Accords. They'll show you how peace was brokered after the Jar conflicts. They'll show you lists of extinct species, lost colonies, dead languages, and yet, in all those endless records, there is no mention of the war that birthed the first contact treaty. Not a single line, not a single name, not a single admission that it ever happened, but we remember because we were there, not in the polished archives or pristine war councils, but in the trenches carved into asteroid belts, in the shattered orbital platforms bleeding atmosphere into the void. We remember the smell of burnt steel, the echo of hulls breaking under kinetic fire, the scream of ships dragged across gravity wells built solely for their destruction. We remember not because we recorded it, but because it was written into us. It began with a lie. The Concorde approached Earth claiming peace, unity, and shared progress. But when they encountered resistance, human suspicion, independence, our refusal to sign blanket pacts of submission, they shifted their approach. Quietly, behind the smiling envoys and cultural liaisons, they sent observation fleets, monitored our communications, influenced trade. They propped up proxy factions, incited conflicts, destabilized regions, waiting for us to crack from within. They thought we wouldn't notice, but we did, and we responded, not with petitions, not with compromise, but with fire. The first Concorde ship destroyed by a human fleet wasn't even attacking. It was just watching. But by then, we had learned that watching wasn't passive. Surveillance was the first act of conquest. They retaliated quickly, thinking to crush the uprising before it spread. They didn't understand. It already had. The war that followed didn't last long by galactic standards, barely 7 years, but it was enough to fracture the illusion of Concorde superiority. They sent fleets to siege Sol. Only one returned, limping and half, mad from the black. They tried to outmaneuver us, deploying A-driven tacticians to outthink human commanders. We responded by doing what no machine could predict. We sacrificed, we misled, we lied better than any synthetic mind ever could. Because for us, war wasn't an equation, it was instinct, it was rage sharpened by millennia of survival, it was chaos, and chaos, as it turned out, was our home turf. Entire sectors became graveyards. Planets turned into traps. We weaponized the very rules of space, gravity, radiation, debris fields. We broke their formations with hit and run tactics so erratic, their simulations couldn't keep up. Every time they adapted, we changed again, and when they finally begged for peace, we didn't answer through diplomats, we answered through silence, because by then the message was already clear. The Concorde would either recognize our terms, or we would keep showing them what it meant to provoke a species that never forgets. And so the treaty was born, not signed in conference halls or ceremonial domes, but in the aftermath of 1,000 blood-soaked voids. They buried the records, called it a regrettable conflict, a misunderstanding, but we kept the names, we kept the logs. We kept the images of Terran Marines dragging broken war machines across orbital wreckage just to plant a flag that said one thing, never again. So now, when new species rise and ask why humans walk unchallenged through the galaxy's most sacred halls, why our ships are allowed to bristle with weapons even in neutral zones, why our diplomats speak with the weight of fire behind every word, they're told it's because we're founding members, because we helped write the treaty. What they're not told is this: the treaty exists because once the Concorde tried to break us, and in doing so, they broke themselves. It began with a Sparks, Maul almost unnoticed, a patrol frigate near the edge of human. Colonized space went dark. Concorde Command assumed a malfunction. When the second disappeared, they grew concerned. By the third, they acted. They sent a fleet, 30 ships strong, to de-escalate what they were already calling human aggression. None of those ships ever returned. The galaxy thought it had seen war. It had not seen our war. They had grown used to conflicts with rules, with traditions, with ceremonial skirmishes, with front lines and ceasefires carefully observed. They believed war was an unfortunate but necessary political tool, but to humanity, war was something else. It was survival, forged in centuries of fire. It was the reason we still existed at all. And when they gave us no choice, when they attacked, when they bombed colonies, when they razed civilian habitats under the assumption that fear would tame us, they made the worst mistake imaginable. They taught us that talking was over. So we answered, we didn't have the numbers, we didn't have the tech. Not in the beginning, but what we did have. What they never accounted for was hate, precision, forged, directed, carved into the marrow of every soldier, every captain, every civilian who watched their world die screaming in vacuum, and we turned that into strategy. The Battle of Karth's Divide was the first turning point. A fleet of human corvettes, a dozen ragged ships, stuck on a Concord armada. No one expected them to win, not even the humans. That was the point. They didn't attack to survive. They attacked to bleed the Concord, to tear a hole so deep in their formation that the second wave could break through. They died screaming battle cries, setting off nuclear cores at close range, turning their ships into guided missiles. The galaxy had no term for it. We called it shock doctrine. The Concord thought we would negotiate once they scorched our moons, but we sent back fleets with names like atonement, retribution, and no peace yet. Ships carried paint scrawled with names of massacred colonies, their captains sworn to die only after doubling the cost, and die they did. They died in systems whose names have been erased from Concord maps. They died on terraformed rocks turned to glass. They died on ships venting air into the black, singing war songs into open channels so the enemy could hear every last note. But they made the galaxy bleed. We sabotaged their wormhole gates, flooded their AI networks with logic viruses crafted by rogue human hackers with nothing left to lose. Entire sectors fell not to force, but to chaos. The Concord couldn't adapt fast enough. They had prepared for war. They had not prepared for humanity, because while they fought for territory, for honor, for policy, we fought for the memories of children suffocated in domes torn apart by their opening salvo. We fought with grief sharpened into knives, with rage calibrated into tactics. Every battle cost us, but every loss was measured, because every loss taught us how to win. The day we turned, the tide was not marked by a grand victory, but by a silence. A Concord capital ship approached Earth orbit alone. No weapons raised, no demands issued. Its commander opened a wide band transmission. He did not threaten. He asked, "What will it take for this to stop?" That was the moment the galaxy understood. Not because of what we said, but because of what we didn't say. We let the silence stretch. We let them stew in the fear of what might come next. We had no need to roar. We had already spoken with fire, with ruin, with every system still burning behind us. The galaxy believed humans were primitives, until they saw how methodically we could destroy them, until they realized that our rage was not chaos, it was design, and it had just begun. They called it a treaty. We called it a warning. It wasn't born in a chamber of diplomats. There were no polished floors, no ceremonial pens, no banners of unity draped across the walls. There were no smiling envoys clinking glasses over shared principles. There were only the smoldering remains of what had once been a Concord fleet, still drifting in low orbit above the ruins of their forward command base, and the silence of a galaxy that had, for the first time, realized it was no longer in control. The Concorde had no choice but to sign, not because they lost tactically, not because they lacked the will, but because they had glimpsed something terrifying in humanity's war: conviction without hesitation. An enemy who would sacrifice entire battalions if it meant sending a single message, who would turn their own soldiers into kinetic weapons, who did not measure cost the same way other species did. We didn't demand peace. We dictated terms. Clause 1, no Concorde fleet, vessel, or autonomous unit shall enter Terran, claimed space without explicit permission. Clause 2, no weapon shall be deployed in proximity to Earth or any of its colonies. Violations would not result in sanctions. They would result in immediate retaliation without negotiation. Clause 3, any attempt to destabilize a human, aligned system, whether politically, economically, or biologically, would be considered an act of war. Clause 4, the treaty shall be enforced not by Concorde oversight, but by Terran judgment. They called it extreme, they called it unorthodox, but they signed it all the same, because the alternative wasn't another war. The alternative was extinction. We carved our demands into the galactic order, not with debate, but with the scars left on Concorde ship hulls and the orbital graveyards of 3 major star systems. Each clause wasn't just written on paper, it was reinforced with memory, with footage, with date, logs of what happened to those who tried to test us during the war. Because there were tests, some factions within the Concorde refused to believe that humans would retaliate after the treaty. They believed we were bluffing, that our rage had burned itself out. One minor admiral, barely a year after the treaty's signing, ordered a stealth drone into the Vesta colony sector, hoping to gather intel. We found it in 5 hours. The admiral's ship was vaporized in 8. No warning, no ceremony, just consequence. Another time, a Concorde trade cartel attempted to sabotage the atmospheric processors on a fringe human colony to destabilize its economy. The perpetrators were traced, cornered, and removed, publicly and decisively. We didn't extradite them. We didn't try them. We made examples of them, because the treaty wasn't written for the Concorde. It was written against them. Every clause served as a blade, sharp, unyielding, and always pointed outward. It wasn't just a contract, it was a declaration: never again would Earth be threatened without response. Never again would we be treated as a footnote in galactic politics. Never again would human blood be spilled without a reckoning that echoed through stars. And so the Concorde, once the proud overseers of galactic peace, learned a new kind of silence. One born not from diplomacy, but from fear. Their archives might not show the war. Their politicians might not speak of it. But the treaty remains in force, in memory, and in blood. Even now, centuries later, no one dares amend it. No one questions its authority. No one tests its borders, because the last time they did, a war didn't end with surrender. It ended with humanity writing the terms in the ashes of a galaxy that thought we could be conquered. They called it a treaty, but make no mistake, it was our final warning. They thought it was over, that once the treaty was signed, the war would fade into the dust of forgotten history, just another ugly footnote in the Galactic Concorde's long, curated legacy of peace through unity. They believed perhaps that humanity would slip quietly into the galactic background, content with its hard-won sovereignty. They thought we would settle down, assimilate, comply, but Earth doesn't forget. We didn't just rebuild, we hardened. The scars left by the war didn't heal. They became foundation, the ruins of bomb. Doubt orbital stations were reforged into defense bastions. The shattered colonies, the ones they thought would never rise again, became strongholds. Every mistake we made during the war, we studied it, archived it, and made damned sure it never happened again. Humanity had entered the galaxy believing, perhaps naively, that cooperation might be possible, that diplomacy might work, that peace could be shared. But after what they did, after the betrayals, the orbital bombardments, the forced disappearances of our ambassadors, the civilian colonies reduced to irradiated glass, we saw the truth. We weren't part of the community. We were a threat to its control, so we stopped playing by their rules. We began to build, not just ships, but doctrines, not just defenses, but philosophies. Our military evolved faster than anyone thought possible. We stopped modeling ourselves after galactic powers. We looked inward, to Earth's own history, to the asymmetric warfare of insurgents, to the brutal efficiency of total war strategies, to psychological operations designed not just to win, but to make future resistance unthinkable. We pioneered Ghost Fleet, stealth armadas that never broadcast a signal, equipped with onboard AI trained not to survive, but to disrupt entire star systems in the event of another incursion. We developed vacuum, adapted marine units capable of surviving in deep space with no life support for days. We created information warfare divisions that could hijack a planetary economy with a whisper. And most terrifying to the Concorde, we started training everyone, not just soldiers, everyone. Civilians were educated in orbital defense theory by the time they finished secondary schooling. Colony managers knew how to reroute reactors into makeshift railguns. Agricultural drones could be reprogrammed into aerial mines with a few keystrokes. The Concorde had made one mistake. They taught us that our survival wasn't guaranteed, so we made sure it was. Then, slowly, something strange happened. They began to fear our silence. We stopped expanding aggressively. We didn't need to. The space we had was enough, for now. But we made it clear, subtly, with movements of fleets just outside claimed borders, with unmanned probes that hovered in neutral territory just long enough to be noticed, that if provoked again, we would not hold back. And the galaxy listened. Entire Concorde sectors redirected traffic around human systems. Former war zones became black zones. No, fly regions marked with nothing more than the Terran flag and a single word etched in every known language, remember. Diplomats stopped speaking in demands. They started asking for assistance, for neutrality, for mercy, and sometimes we granted it, because we were no longer just a species. We were a lesson, a warning burned into galactic memory that humanity does not forget, that we do not forgive easily, and that once we bleed, we don't just patch the wound, we reinforce it with steel. We hadn't just survived, we had become something new, something the galaxy had never seen before. A species that, when broken, didn't rebuild the same. We rebuilt stronger, smarter, colder, and far, far more dangerous. The galaxy hadn't tamed us. It had taught us how to bite back harder. There's a saying, whispered in hushed tones across trading posts and border stations at the edge of civilized space. If a Terran smiles during negotiations, it's already too late. It's not just superstition. It's lived experience, passed along by those who survived the last time someone tested the strength behind that smile. Because the truth is, humans didn't just write the first contact treaty in blood. They rewrote the very nature of diplomacy itself. Before us, diplomacy in the galaxy was ceremonial, predictable. It followed ancient rites and linguistic dances developed over millennia. Disagreements were slow. Posturing was elaborate. An insult might take years to provoke a response. It was a game of patience and pride. Then humanity entered the room and flipped the table. We didn't posture. We didn't perform. We spoke in direct terms, with eyes that had seen planets die and cities fall. When we negotiated, it wasn't to gain favor. It was to prevent escalation, and that shift, it scared them more than our weapons ever could, because they realized, every time a human delegation arrived, it meant war was a real possibility. Not a hypothetical, not a diplomatic threat, real. That's what gave our words weight, not our numbers, not our power, but the memory of what we'd done before, and the quiet understanding that we were still very much capable of doing it again. And so the galaxy changed, not because we asked it to, but because it had to. Neutral zones once patrolled by Concord fleets were now observed jointly, under Terran authority. Trade routes were redrawn to avoid even the edge of Terran colonies. Entire systems were marked off, limits, not because humans occupied them, but because we had visited once and left something behind. A signal, a warning buoy, a single shattered drone, and that was enough. When a dispute broke out between two minor species over resource rights in Sector 41, they didn't call on the Concord for arbitration. They called on us, not because they trusted us to be fair, but because they trusted us to be final. Human mediation meant resolution, brutal, swift, and unquestioned. If two parties refused to come to terms, we didn't drag it out with months of symbolic exchanges. We gave them one chance, then we imposed order. It wasn't kindness, it was clarity. We weren't diplomats, we were deterrents, and somewhere along the way that became our legacy. Children in distant systems grew up studying Earth's war doctrines in schools, not to fight, but to understand why you never want to. Young officers in Concord academies were required to watch footage from the siege of Titan. The grainy, silent images of human marines advancing through orbital wreckage without air or fear. We became myth. Not heroes, not villains, something older, something that lives in the space between silence and violence, something that remembers, because that's what they never understood at first. We don't love war. We don't crave domination. We just remember what it's like to be underestimated, to be spoken down to be invited to the table only to find the meal had already been served, without us, and we never forget. So now, when a new species discovers faster than light travel and the Concord prepares its welcome fleets, someone always steps in, a quiet advisor, a veteran diplomat, a graying admiral, and they whisper, "Let the humans go first," because they know. They all know the first contact treaty wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a truth the galaxy could no longer ignore. You can talk to humans, you can trade with humans, you can even befriend humans. But if you ever draw their blood again, you won't be signing another treaty. You'll be reading your own eulogy.